Good day and welcome back to the Ottawa History Hub podcast. We've been talking about the early settlement of the Ottawa area and explored that area on our trip to Kingston, as well as the construction of the Rideau Canal. On the subject of construction, by the conclusion of the Rideau Canal project, there have been only a few proper houses built in Upper Town, a few log cabins in the LeBreton Flats area, and some shanties in Lower Town. The town of Hull on the Lower Canada side of the river would be the only part of the area that we would describe as urban, with the next nearest towns being Perth and L'Orignal as regional centres in Upper Canada. The Filman Wright & Sons Cement Company was doing its best to transform Hull into a city of stone, but at this point all these towns were made of lumber, hewn from the eternal forests that surrounded them. When the Rideau Canal was completed, there was a question as to what would keep the hundreds of labourers in town, or would they all just disperse, some going to Montreal, others venturing to Kingston or York, looking for greener pastures. The answer was in the forest, as lumber was the most easily accessible cash product to bring to markets. Harvesting and processing trees was labour-intensive, as was transporting them to the nearest export harbour. With an abundance of trees and an abundance of labour, the nascent lumber industry began to flourish, even before the conclusion of the Rideau Canal. Prior to the Napoleonic Wars, Britain imported most of her lumber from the Baltic countries, principally Sweden, though she also brought in some from the Americas, from New Hampshire mostly, prior to the American War of Independence, of course. After which, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia filled that role. When the war with the French isolated England from the Baltic trade through the embargo and high tariffs, the need increased and lumber from anywhere was in demand. The Ottawa Valley was rich in white pine, red pine, and oak, all of which were indispensable for England. Softwoods like birch were not so important at this point. The hardwoods were used for shipbuilding, home construction, and potash for fertilizer. Generally speaking, pine and oak were used for ships, and maple for potash. Traditionally, potash is a fertilizer made by burning wood into gray ashes. Softwoods don't work well for this, as they often have a higher sap or oil content, and don't produce as pure a product as harder, drier woods. The ashes are then mixed with water into a paste and left to dry into a flaky, crumbly powder called potash. It's a great fertilizer because it's rich in potassium, which is where the chemical gets its name from, and is toxic to many insects. So using it on crops increases the plant yield by nutrients and by keeping pests away. Modern potash is made by mining salt-rich ancient seabeds and not by burning trees. Canada is a huge exporter of potash to this day, even though the modern commodity is quite different from this older incarnation. The first timber run down the Ottawa took place in 1806, and we touched on that back in episode 9, The Squire of Hull. At that point, Filman Wright, his son Tiberius, London Oxford, and some other earlier settlers, mostly in-laws of the Wrights, traveled down the river in rafts to bring logs to market in Quebec City. How 6 men could wrangle 700 pieces of oak, 9,000 boards and planks, and thousands of staves merits some description. Rick Henderson does a great job describing these pragmatics in his book, Capital Chronicles, and I'll summarize that work here. First things first, trees do not grow standard. Not in terms of length, thickness, or straightness, and as living things they have unique little imperfections that can make them a little unpredictable. They're like people that way. The second consideration is that these rafts would not be built as reusable boats, but as part of the lumber to be sold at market. So there wasn't to be much drilling, boring, or damaging of the goods. Whenever possible, the rafts would have to be held together by ropes, sinews, chains, and prayer. Rafts would consist of a series of interconnected squares of timber called cribs. The cribs could be removed from the raft to pass through a narrow section of the river and then reattached to the raft afterwards to continue along through wider passages of the Ottawa. The narrowest point of the voyage from the upper Ottawa Valley was 26 feet, so cribs were typically 25.5 feet wide. 2 long timbers would be selected as the base of the crib, usually 40 to 50 feet in length. Then a 25-foot transverse would be placed atop them and fastened with oak pins. There would usually be 3 to 5 traverses to ensure that the crib would keep its shape when the water got choppy. Then logs were placed between these base timbers, under the traverses, until the space was filled. The lumber would be secured with birch saplings, gummy sap, rope, and minimal iron rowlocks. An open third layer of lumber would be placed lengthwise on top of the traverses to keep everything in place, and then your crib was ready to attach. Cribs would be attached together, 90 or even 200 strong, and the mighty raft would be ready to set sail down the river. Set sail might not be accurate, because the rafts traveled with the current, and the crews merely steered them to make sure that they wouldn't run aground or break up the raft into its component cribs. A final touch on the rafts would be a crowning of a small wooden shack, where the crew could sleep, store supplies, keep a fire burning on a bed of sand, just to keep warm and to cook food. Once arriving in Quebec City, the rafts would then break into their cribs and occupy the numerous nearby coves until a purchase could be arranged. Then a crew would make their way back home, usually a few days on stagecoach. 100,000 tons of Ottawa Valley lumber made its way to the ships in Quebec this way in 1806, a number that would more than triple by the time the Rideau Canal began its construction 12 years later. Where these trees came from was a bit of a wild market. Theoretically, trees could only be harvested from specific areas where the lumber companies had license, but in practice, this was not the case on both sides of the river. The northern, Lower Canada side was regulated from Hull. For the Upper Canada side, being 80 kilometers from the nearest courthouses in Perth, was less regulated. And who's to say where some of that lumber actually came from? In 1820, John Le Breton complained that poachers from the North Shore were stealing his trees. In 1826, John By complained to the Governor-General, the topic of our last episode, that most of the trees on Barracks Hill, the future Parliament Hill, had been cut down. They were supposed to be used for the Rideau Canal construction, so Dalhousie told By that he could use any trees on Crown land, including the land currently being used by some of the remaining Algonquin communities of the Rideau, including the land of the Partridge clan of Constant Pénessé, driving them off the land that was now spoiled for hunting. During the construction of the canal, Ruggles Wright, one of Filman's sons, made a lumberman's pilgrimage to Sweden to learn from the best with regards to the most advanced techniques of harvesting and processing lumber. While there, he witnessed the great engineering feat that was the lumber slide. When he returned to his father's house, he brought this technique with him, and he went about constructing one on the north side of the Chaudière Falls. Prior to the construction of the slide, logs would have been decoupled from one another to portage around the falls. Cribs could brave white water, but the waterfall was a bridge too far. The 26-foot slide was just what the name implied, a slide that a crib might be moored into near the top of the falls, and then, rather than crash 15 meters from the top to the bottom of the falls, it would stretch out that fall over the hypotenuse of a few hundred meters before landing on the lower Ottawa. It was hardly a safe procedure, killing people every year of its existence. But what it lacked in safety, it made up for in speed for the lumber industry, and profitability for the Wrights, who owned and operated the slide. This was a lucrative venture for the old squire, and served to open up the Ottawa Valley, west of Chaudière Falls, to exploitation. While it could take a raft several days to pass by the falls, it was now faster than ever before, and there was a lower chance of loss of lumber to damage from the waterfall. The next 3 years would be steady growth for the lumber industry on the Ottawa. After those 3 years, the lumber industry didn't die off or even plateau. It went into overdrive. With the end of the Rideau Canal construction project, the existing labor camp of Bytown was now filled with unemployed people, many of whom were experienced lumbermen. There was enough of an existing community infrastructure to facilitate recruitment, housing, and people were ready to transfer their employment from government works to the private sector, a recurring theme in the local economy. At this time, Lower Town, the kernel of future Bytown, didn't look like it would become a town. Most people would have looked at it as a labor camp about to be dispersed. There were very few women, few businesses, rudimentary sewage and services. It was also inhabited mostly by Irish and French Catholics, in an avowedly Protestant country. The likelihood of this community getting any kind of official patronage was minimal at best. That surplus of labor was funneled into the lumber industry quite directly. Phil Jenkins, in his An Acre in Time, noted that French workers were better lumberjacks, but the Irish were, as he put it, more brutal. They used intimidation tactics to make employers take them on. Their tactics included polluting wells, random muggings, burning stables, and for some reason, cutting off the ears of horses and men and pitting them over a bar. When the French lost patience and fought back, the ends of the Chaudière Bridge became regular battlegrounds. During the construction of the canal, 2 populations shared space in Bytown as a rough-and-tumble work camp. But when the job situation changed, they would find themselves in competition, and a shared religion was not enough to forge a community of the 2 camps. The competition and hostility between the 2 populations would lead to years of street violence, riots, and even murders. There was still animosity between the 2 communities, even after the Second World War. There's an old expression that love finds a way. Well, so too does hate, and it seems to outlast something as paltry as love when echoing through the generations. One of the people poised to take advantage of this glut of labor, ease of transport, and surplus of material was an Irish immigrant by the name of John Egan. I'm sorry that I've already, in this episode, spoken about John LeBreton, John By, now John Egan, and later on I'm going to mention John Booth. That's a lot of Johns. People complain about modern names, where everyone's invented weird, idiosyncratic names for children, but I am absolutely fine with that. I'm glad that we're no longer stuck with the namesakes of the same 4 apostles over-flavoring the local register salad with the occasional Old Testament spices for variety. John Egan worked as a depot clerk in Clarendon Township on the Lower Canada side of the Upper Ottawa Valley, outfitting lumbermen and coordinating supplies for a variety of camps. He worked for Thomas Durrell until 1836, when he founded the Ottawa Lumber Association. That same year, George Buchanan built a lumber slide on the south shore of the Chaudière Falls, breaking the Wrights' monopoly over the choke point between the upper and the lower Ottawa. More and more rafts were braving the Ottawa by the 1830s, and log-driving raftsmen began to develop a community of their own, different from the aspiring farmer who began to inhabit the land cleared by the lumber trade. I'm going to recite the words to an Irish river chanty, where the words can give some insight into how the raftsmen saw themselves and how they saw their agrarian neighbours. O ye maidens of Ontario, give ear to what I write, in driving down these rapid streams where raftsmen take delight. In driving down these rapid streams as raftsmen they must do, while these low and loafing farmer boys they stay at home with you. Oh, these low and loafing farmer boys, they tell the girls great tales. They'll tell them of great dangers in crossing o'er the fields, while cutting of the grass and weeds is all that they can do, while we poor jolly raftsmen are running the long Sioux. Apologies for my singing. No one has ever accused me of being able to carry a tune with a bucket. That little ditty gave some insight into how the raftsmen would look at the more settled farming communities that they pass. It shows some pride in their own masculinity, while being disallowed the presence of women in their own world. The world of the lumber trade was without the norms of society, in terms of family, and a heteronormative presence of women, and, like so often happens in this type of environment, in many lands, in many times, violence steps in to mar this masculine world. Not just the drunken brawls that would occur upon occasion in the emerging community of Bytown, but also the presence of organized crime and even piracy. Gangs of Irish ruffians would row a simple drawboat to intercept the rafts, beat or chase off and sporadically murder the raftsmen, and then drive the rafts on to Montreal or Quebec to sell and keep the profits for themselves. These Irish pirates would attack French-run rafts, a reminder to the lumber barons that they should be hiring Irishmen instead of Frenchmen. The pirates were called shiners, after the French word chêneur, or oakman. Later on this season, we'll be taking a look at the Shiners' War, when Bytown became one of the most dangerous corners of the British Empire. We'll look at the lumber baron, legitimate businessman / king of the Shiners, Peter Aylin, and the larger-than-life French lumberjack and street-fighting man who opposed them, Joseph Mifferrand, or Big Joe Mufferaw, as Stompin' Tom Connors described him. Even though the timber trade brought about these unsavory elements, John Egan was a very legitimate businessman, who even entered into a duel when a Bytown lawyer, Andrew Powell, of Powell Avenue in the Glebe fame, when Powell said that one of Egan's friends was not a true gentleman. Apparently, neither duelist was a great shot, and no one was hurt, let alone killed. Egan would become the MP for Pontiac from 1848 to 57, at which time he employed 3,500 lumberjacks in over 100 camps, spanning 10,000 square miles. Despite that, he still found time to found the town of Eganville, west of Renfrew, and there's an Egan Street near Mooney's Bay. John Egan was far from the only lumber merchant to find his name on a street in Ottawa. Alan Gilmore was a Scottish lumberman and art connoisseur who assembled the finest art collection in Bytown, and is the namesake of Gilmore Street in Centretown. James McLaren of McLaren Street, also in Centretown, controlled the second-largest lumber consortium after Egan's death, and was a prime mover in the creation of the Bank of Ottawa. The largest lumber group of the day was owned by Booth Street namesake John Rodolphus Booth. Booth was the first of the Canadian-born lumber magnates, the son of an Ulsterman, born in the eastern townships. The busiest of the lumberman streets would of course be the one named after Henry Franklin Bronson, who cultivated lumber for export to his native New England. The lumber industry put roots in the Ottawa area, created a demand for wage labor that the small family farms were not, and this demand for a workforce is what made possible the settlement of a town, instead of just a labor camp. Bytown would be a city of wood, not just in terms of buildings, but in terms of the industry that was to build a community. Thank you everyone for listening to this episode of the Ottawa History Hub podcast. Please take a moment to leave a 5-star rating wherever you access this, and write a review if you can. I certainly appreciate it. This show is written, researched, performed, and produced by myself, Brendan Ray. You can follow me on Facebook or Blue Sky as the Ottawa History Hub, or on X Twitter as @OttHistoryHub. Until next time, take care everyone, and advance Ottawa en avant.